When you're producing a size measured drawing, there's a few useful bits of equipment to have. Obviously you want something to draw with. In this instance I'm drawing with one of those Kohinoor pilot pencils. This holds a lead, or it can hold compressed charcoal in a good firm handle. I quite like personally the way that this feels in my hand. A clear plastic ruler, or in this instance a set square, is also really useful. And what I've done here is I've made some measuring calipers. These are made from very simple plant labels. I've used one of those butterfly clips through the centre here, and I've joined them together so that I can hold the calipers up, I can move the calipers open, and I can use the calipers to measure a distance. But also, if I hold the calipers to a horizontal, I can move the arm to measure an angle. I can measure against a vertical or a horizontal. So that's a very simple set of tools. In that instance, if I'm then measuring the height, say for instance, of this thigh, it's quite easy for me to transfer that measurement across. Obviously in this instance I'm working with a photograph, so that you can see a photograph and you can see the drawing at the same time. In the real world this would be the model in the distance, and this would be my easel. As I'm right-handed, I would set my easel such that my drawing was immediately to the right of the model, as close to the edge of the drawing board as possible, to minimise the distance between what I'm drawing and what I'm looking at. In that sense I could literally be looking at this leg and almost tracing this leg with my eye. So where do you begin? Well, it makes a great deal of sense to think about the idea of, if I was to bring a vertical down, where is the highest point of the figure? So if I hold my clear plastic ruler up to the figure, I can begin to see that that hip and almost that elbow is at the same visual height. So I know that the figure sits on this line. If you're working from the model, you can do the same thing. You can adjust the height of your easel and your drawing board such that a part of the figure lines up. If you're sitting down in front of the figure and you have your drawing board resting on your lap, it's a good idea to try to tip up that drawing board so that you're looking at the drawing perpendicular to your line of sight rather than at an angle, because that can cause foreshortening. But also what you do then is, if you've got the model in front of you, you take vertical distances down onto your drawing. So a knee would line up to your knee on the drawing, an elbow on an elbow, etc. on your drawing. So the height of the figure, what's the lowest point of the figure? If I bring my ruler up, what's the point where the ruler touches the figure at the bottom? So in a size measured drawing, the drawing that you make is going to be small. It's going to be based on the size that the model appears to be. Now clearly, if you were closer to the model, your drawing would be larger. If you were further away from the model, then the drawing would be smaller. In a way, what I need to do next is to ascertain the width of the figure, and I'm going to do that initially by measuring the width of the figure with my pencil. So if I run my thumb across this pencil, I can capture that measurement, and I can then decide where am I going to place that distance. I want to make sure that my figure is going to appear in the right position on my paper. So what I've created now is a rectangle. That rectangle should correspond with the box that the model sits in. So what's the widest point on the left, what's the widest point on the right, and my figure should fit within this box. What I need to do next is to try to work out where the limbs are. And it's important not to think about the limbs at all, but instead it's much better to think about, if this rectangle is essentially the big space around the figure, can I trim that rectangle down? Can I begin to see some of the other main directions. So this angle here, I could hold my pencil up to that angle and I could move my pencil across so that I can replicate that angle. And if I pull the pencil towards myself, continuing the line of the pencil, I can transfer that angle to my paper. Equally, if I held the calipers up to a vertical and opened up the calipers, could I capture that angle and transfer that to my drawing? When I'm then looking here and I'm looking at this angle, will I begin to see this angle? There's a very, very slight little incline between that hip and that shoulder. As I look here and I measure, whenever you measure, never measure on the angle, always measure against vertical or horizontal distances. If one gets the angle wrong, then the measurement would certainly be wrong. Whereas if you're measuring this height and bringing this height across, or indeed holding the ruler up to that height, we can hold the ruler up to that height and again ascertain that that point is that point in space. If our angle is wrong, we can always correct that later on. So I could measure from this point outwards, and that might start giving me a sense of where that outer point of the arm is here and what the width of this arm might be here. If I measure from here across, I might start to get a sense of this shape, and what I'm going to look for now is this triangular shape. So how far does that come down? How far does that come across? So again, holding my pencil to try to capture that angle, or indeed holding my calipers out and bringing that angle across. If I measure from the outermost point of my rectangle to that hip, go back to here, I can then begin to locate the positioning of that hip. Now again, I can roughly see that there's a broad angle coming down to about here. That knee rests along this edge here. That angle, as I come across this way, comes across to here. That elbow comes across to about here. That angle comes across on the diagonal like so. And what I'm starting to form is a kind of rough pentagram. And into that pentagram I'm beginning to see some of the negative shapes, so the space behind the figure. So where is this ankle in relationship to that angle? Where is that knee in relationship to that thigh? I'm starting to look here at this angle between the two knees, and I'm trying to now see that triangle that's being formed by those two knees. Where is this height? If I'm looking at the gap here, do I measure that gap? And again, I could measure that from that point, from the outer edge. I can begin to perceive that negative space inside here. I'm measuring from this distance here, trying to find out that width. This starts to give me a sense of the placement of the head. Clearly the head is very close to me. It's a foreshortened figure, so that head is going to occupy a great deal of space. Again, if I move this to here, that starts to give me a sense of how high the nose is. So if one was to measure that distance between the base of the head and the nose and bring that up, as we would do on the figure, you can see that that's halfway down the figure. Again, measurement really is a process by which we want to objectify our vision. We don't want to be clouded by what we think the figure's doing in space. More often than not, a figure reclining would mean that our drawing gets longer. Most students elongate because they know that the figure is long. And much the same way that when you look at a building site being constructed, you'll often see not a lot happen for a long period of time. What's indeed happening is the foundations are being constructed. So this really is a process of building those foundations, building those reference points. And as time progresses, there becomes more and more correlationship between those points in space. You begin to understand that that thigh is in that position. You begin to sense that that curve is a gentle one. So another way of thinking about this is, imagine you're a sculptor and you're about to build a marble sculpture. So you've ordered a piece of marble from the local quarry, and you want to make sure that you've ordered a big enough piece of stone before you start carving, and equally you're minimising the chiseling away of your unwanted material. So it's going to be important to get those big structures established first. If you start off the drawing quite broadly, then you might find it's much easier to make adjustments to that drawing rather than going in too specifically too soon. One's constantly thinking about those relationships. Where is this elbow in relationship to the ankle? Does that tell me that I've misseen that distance? Does it tell me that I've not placed that ankle in the right location? So what one starts to do is one compares the life model with the life model and the drawing with the drawing, gradually finding one's way around the elements, checking constantly whether one's made the right decision. It's very easy to bring to bear those misconceptions of the figure. So you're not really trying to think about how do I draw a leg. You're really, just as we've talked about before, thinking what is that shape? How does that shape connect to the next shape? So like partial peak drawing, we're almost building a kind of jigsaw, considering one shape's relationship to another, tentatively measuring out. If measured drawing had a sound, it would be a quiet sound. Measured drawing is contemplative. One stills one's head. One is nervous, trying to find your way through this space, reviewing, constantly checking. Of course, the figure is important, but also one must utilise the space behind the figure. Those reference points to the space helps establish how the figure lies on the ground. Those reference points in the space behind, in this instance we have easels. Easels drawing boards, etc., can be used to think about where aspects of the figure are. So what's above, what's below. Of course, although those things are actually there, you don't necessarily need to include them in the drawing, but you can absolutely include them in your decision-making process. Nothing becomes more important than the other. Everything takes its role within the drawing. Everything can be used to help you locate the position of another part of the drawing. If you begin the drawing quite lightly, then it's easier to correct the drawing without necessarily rubbing out what you've drawn. Once you're really happy that you've positioned elements of the drawing in the right location, then you can start to reflect on line quality and how you can begin to articulate the differences between soft flesh, hard bone, muscle under tension, etc. As well as think about the way that lines can recede or come forward according to their strength. So thicker, darker lines have a tendency to come forward, fainter lines have a tendency to recede. There's the drawing.